Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you very much to everybody for coming. And for some of our distinguished guests, we have several distinguished guests in the audience. Firstly, to our speakers, to our panelists, Professor Lynn Morris, the DVC for Research, Professor Brett Bauman, and Dr. Robin Drennan, who have all been very supportive of research in our faculty and obviously making a huge difference for the university. It really is a privilege for me to welcome you to this year's faculty prestigious lecture. And it's a moment in our calendar where we come together to reflect and to celebrate and to look ahead with what is our purpose here at the faculty. And if you look at the video that was playing and just the circular of all the previous prestigious lectures that have happened and several of the people who actually are in the audience, it really is a moment for us to celebrate some of the real excellence in research that's coming out from this faculty. But this past year has not been an easy one. We've weathered significant funding cuts, shifting global priorities, and pressures that were felt across the entire sector. And these challenges really have tested us, not just institutionally, but also personally. Yet, what has defined our faculty is not the difficult circumstances that we had to face, but really the resilience of the people in this faculty. And despite these hurdles, our researchers have continued to push boundaries, to secure competitive grants, publish world-leading work, and mentor the next generation of scholars. Laboratories kept innovating, fieldwork pressed on, collaborations thrived, and the ideas that might have seemed impossible not so long ago really came to life. And your commitment is not only sustained our faculty, but it is elevated. So tonight we celebrate excellence. We celebrate the breakthroughs, the partnerships, the awards, the discoveries, and the persistence that made them possible. Most of all, we celebrate the spirit that defines this community: curiosity, integrity, and an enduring belief in the power of research to shape a better future for all. So tonight I really want to take a moment to say thank you to the researchers in this faculty. I've got to know many of you on a very personal level this year, very quickly, and really it's been an amazing journey with many of the researchers in this faculty. But tonight we are looking forward, and few areas exemplify the future more profoundly than the domain of artificial intelligence. AI research is transforming the way we understand data, solve complex problems, and imagine new horizons across every discipline represented in this faculty. It challenges us intellectually, ethically, and creatively, and it invites us to lead. I was recently at a talk in Sweden, and one of the questions that was posed also on this topic is how do AI make us as researchers better? And I think that's a very pertinent question that we will unpack tonight. So tonight's lecture, which is titled From Data to Diagnosis, Rethinking Medicine in the Age of AI, we are not only recognizing where we've been, but we are looking at the step towards where we are going. It is an opportunity to explore how emerging technologies, driven by collaboration between scientists, engineers, clinicians, and policymakers, will define the next era of discovery. So thank you again for joining us tonight, and thank you for your resilience, your excellence, and your continued belief in the work we do. And now it's my honor to introduce our two scholars for the evening. So I'm going to briefly read both of their bios, and our first speaker for the evening is Professor Collen Masimirembwa. He's a distinguished professor at the University of the Witwatersrand and a scientist at the Sydney Brenner Institute for Molecular Biosciences. And he's the founding president and CEO of BST in Zimbabwe. A pioneer in genomics and precision medicine, he developed Africa's first clinical pharmacogenetic testing panel and has been recognized with major honors, including the Gates Foundation, the PMWC Pioneer Award, the African Genius Laureate, and recently the Alexander von Humboldt Research Award. His work spans drug discovery, translational research, and capacity building, including the Spark Africa program. And he is the leading voice on the role of AI and machine learning in advanced pharmacogenomics. Our next speaker is Professor Bruce Bassett. He's a distinguished professor of computer science at the Wits Mind Institute and also a professor of applied mathematics at the University of Cape Town. His research focuses on theory and applications of AI. Bruce was formerly the head of data science at the Square Kilometre Array Africa. On the industry side, Bruce has co-founded several startups. After an undergraduate and MSc at UCT, Bruce went to Italy and then to Oxford University for his PhD and postdoctoral years, before returning to Cape Town with a vision to help build science capacity in South Africa. First in cosmology and later in machine learning, statistics and AI. And now he's using all of those skills and applying them in health in our faculty. So, Professor Masimirembwa.
So good evening, everyone, and it's really a great honor to be invited to come and speak. And I really think that I'm not from typical academic background, so really seeing all the academicians here really gives me a sense of happiness, because I left the university many, many years ago, and I've just rejoined it by coming to the WITS. So the WITS has been a great place for me in terms of translating the science I do to kind of applications in the translational space. So today, I will talk a lot about how genomics is playing a role in precision medicine, and then Bruce will come along, probably try to show how AI is going to really make our movement from lab bench to patient bedside a fast process and a profitable process for the patient as well as the biomedical industry. So the title of my talk is Genomic Diversity in Africa, Pharmacogenetics and Clinical Implications. So I will start with a typical disclaimer that I'm always talking about Africa, but I've realized over the years it's a massive claim, because Africa is truly an enormous place to talk about. 1.4 billion people in 55 countries, and speaking 3,000 languages. And yet what makes us think about it is that Africa has a common burden of disease, where it carries 25% of the diseases, and yet its commitment to solving those problems in terms of financial contribution is very low at 2.5% of GDP. And also what makes me think it's possible to speak at a continental level is that when you look at the genomic variation, African populations carry over 200 times variability compared to other global populations in Asia or in Europe. And I think these common features make me think that at a certain point we can speak continentally, and then eventually we'll drill down to either national or regional spaces in terms of solutions, as I will show as I go forward. And for many people, usually when I'm presenting in Europe, I try to remind people that Europe just fits in a small corner of this great continent. Because sometimes when you go there, there's a sense of the language that makes you think you are coming from a small place to a big place. Yet actually you're going to a very small place from a big place. So I always want to use this diagram to emphasize the point. So what has been happening over the years, I have been studying human genetics for many years, and in particularly the African populations, with the idea that are African populations as homogeneous as we are perceived to be. And way back, maybe 10 years ago, we did a study where we looked at about 2,000 patients from Nigeria, from Kenya, Tanzania, and we compared that to the Asian populations as well as European populations. From this PCA plot, you can clearly see that in the first component, there's actually no separation between the Asian populations and European populations. They all cluster. If you drop the Asian populations to the line and bring up the Caucasians, they are quite close to each other. And when you look at the African populations, whilst they are distinct by themselves, amongst themselves, they show huge variability. So the idea that you are talking of a single definable African population really needs to start fading away as we really look at the diversity and find solutions that work for this diverse population. And a year later, the 1,000 Genomes Project also clearly looked at whole genomes. And when you look at variation per genome, you will see that the other world populations below, they have lower genetic variation per genome. If you compare to the African populations, which is where I've put a circle there, there is huge genetic variation per genome. So this really tells you that when you are dealing with these two populations, it's likely that their risk for disease is going to be different. Their response to medicines is likely to be different as well. So already the genetics start to tell you that you should look in certain spaces to be able to find solutions. And what was done recently at SBIMB was to use whole genome sequences that had been sort of generated through the H3 Africa initiative. And again, what was now evident is that there are clusters of similarity in West Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, as well as Eastern Africa. What this then started to help us think is that instead of looking at the variability as a problem, we can find that there are clusters that can be treated with some level of similarity in terms of medical solutions. Because it was backfiring for me, the more I spoke about it to industry, then industry was now challenging me and saying, are we going to develop a drug for each and every African walking around? And obviously, it's not going to work like that. There are clusters of similarities that can guide the design of diagnostic tests, as well as the coming up with dosing or choice of medicines to use. Again, work done at the SBIMB clearly also showed that per unit of DNA sequence, there will be more variation in the Africans. So the lower line there shows the European populations, and the two lines on top show the African American, and as well as the data from the Africans native on the continent. So again, still speaking to the idea that there's huge genetic variation. And I've been trying to promote the idea that because of this huge genetic variation, our understanding of biology is best studied in Africa, because you already have the natural variation to explore the function of genes, or understanding processes better, because nature has already provided you with the resource to do so. So I'm hoping that this can encourage people to want to come and do genetic research in Africa, as it will have that positive advantage. Now, in terms of translating this variation to actual clinical situations, we have been studying this enzyme called CYP2D6. This enzyme handles more than 20% of the medicines that are on the market. So a variation in that gene will translate to your variation in terms of how you respond to those medicines. And if you look at this particular gene in Africa, we have found genetic variants that are only unique to African people, the STAR17 and the STAR29. As you can see from those bars, it is only found in people of African ancestry. And when you look to the Asian populations, there's a STAR10 variant, which is associated with reduced activity, and there will be some people in the different populations, because of admixture, who will end up with those variations. And when you do further, you will find that in people of European ancestry, the STAR4, which is associated with the lack of activity, is more common there. So you can already see that for this enzyme that controls 20% of the medicines you see in the pharmacy, you are likely to respond differently at individual level as well as at population level. So what does this mean to the use of medicines? So when you go to the doctor with a common sort of diagnosis, the prescription is usually the same, but the outcomes are very different. There will be people who will have no response, so the drug is really a placebo. And there are people who will have side effects, so they pay money to be poisoned to some extent. And then there will be a lot of people who will, of course, have the benefit that is desired. But when you look at the level of adverse drug reactions, which is the biggest burden, you will find that 59% of the adverse drug reactions are usually due to genetic differences between individuals. And when you look at lack of efficacy of medicines, again, you will see that 20 to 90% of it is mainly due to genetic differences. So therefore, understanding genomics is really one starting point to optimizing the safety and efficacy of medicines. And this is what we have been working on the past 20 years, to say, can we provide diagnostic tests and dosing algorithms that can inform our clinicians on which medicine should be given to a particular patient, and at what dose should we be giving them, so that the outcome is predicted to be the desired response of minimum side effects and optimal efficacy. So two examples that have really been occupying our research over the years. It is the HIV drug efavirenz, which, when it is high concentrations, it is associated with neuropsychiatric side effects. And it is metabolized by an enzyme called CYP2B6. So if you have defects in that particular enzyme, you will not be able to remove the drug. And it will keep increasing in concentration until it becomes toxic. So we have worked on this drug because more than 30% people of African ancestry end up having these side effects of neuropsychiatric side effects. And then the other drug we've been working on is tamoxifen, which is a breast cancer drug, where the drug itself is a prodrug. It needs to be activated by that same enzyme CYP2D6 to the active metabolite called endoxifen. And there are many patients who are failing to activate. So when they are given that drug, they will not be able to activate it to the active one. So they will not have the benefit for the breast cancer treatment. So these are the two drugs we have worked a lot in the past couple of years. And for the efavirenz, basically what we could show is that when it was introduced in Europe, only a few patients had severe side effects. But when it was introduced in sub-Saharan Africa, there was an outcry in hospitals as many patients suffered severe neuropsychiatric side effects. And we went and we took some samples from there, sequenced them, and we were able to show that the frequency of a genetic variant associated with reduced activity was so high in people of African ancestry and was lower in people of European ancestry. As you can see from those bars, the people of Asian and European ancestry, so the drug was acceptable at the 600 milligram doses. So we then developed a dosing algorithm that could allow us to say who should be given 200, 400, and 600 milligrams. And this really pushed a lot WHO to end up changing the dose from the 600 milligrams to the 400 milligrams. And the modeling from Clinton Health Initiative really showed that the savings from using this genetic test would actually amount to over $300 million. But immediately after that, we had developed a genetic test and got it registered, but immediately there was a change to dolutegravir. So the business case got lost. That's why I'm still not without money, but in the future we'll be luckier. So the issue of efavirenz, really we wrote the guidelines, and there was a clear way of how the doctors can be guided how to use it. So now dolutegravir is there. Of course, it has its own challenges we are looking into. But the drug we are working a lot on these days is tamoxifen, because we realize that many people, over 30% to 40%, lack the enzyme activity to bioactivate tamoxifen to endoxifen. And when you look at the different populations, in European populations, they are easily able to metabolize the drug to endoxifen, but most African women are not able. So we have done work with the Baragwanath Hospital, where there's a cohort of breast cancer patients there, and we can clearly see that most of them, they had very little amounts in their blood of endoxifen, and most of them had high frequency of star 17 and star 29, hence unable to metabolize this particular drug. So what we have been now doing with this drug is to try to model how we can increase the concentration. So we have shown that if you are able to increase the dose from 20 milligrams to 40 milligrams, because the genetic variant is reduced activity. So if you do the enzyme kinetics, you can increase the amount of substrate so that it can produce more metabolite. So we are thinking that, so we now got funding so that we can do a clinical study to use 40 milligrams instead of 20 milligrams, and with the hope that we can now improve the case. So we started to see that these cases are all speaking to the idea that in Africa, most drugs developed in Europe cannot be transferred as is to the African population. So we looked globally at the drugs on the WHO essential drugs list, which are more than 500. And we noticed that 57 of them would require a genetic test before they can be used effectively. So when you look at this graph, when we analyze those drugs, you can see that the section in orange means that drug needs genetic testing in African patients so that you can either change the drug or change the dose. So if you look at those oranges and you add them up, you can see there is actually a clinical case for us to do something about it. So this led us to develop a comprehensive panel which can look at about 100 drugs, and we are able to tell which drug you should take and at what dose you should take it. So that test is called Genopharm. And now the Gates Foundation has funded us to expand it across Africa in 6,000 patients in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. So we really hope we are pushing this move to genetics-guided precision medicine. But what has been happening is that we have been looking a lot at common variants occurring at 1 to 5%. But it turns out that when we look at variability in drug response, those common variants are only able to explain around 30 or so of the variation. The other variation is sitting in very rare variants, which are difficult to make a simple genetic test on, because you will see that the novel variants are so much more than what we know. And in Africa in particular, where sequencing is very little, we are beginning to say, how are we going to adjust to the new variations coming up every day? And that is really where AI and machine learning is really going to start to help us to tackle this problem of information which we didn't have before. So what we are thinking now is that each time you sequence, if you like to discover for the young scientists in the audience, studying human genetics in Africa, you are likely to discover something. So it gives you a bit of confidence to discover something, in your early career. So what is happening is that we are then discovering so many new variants, we don't know how to predict their function. And I think the traditional methods of heterologous expression or of finding a patient who has the genetic variant, if they are rare, and giving them their drug is not practical. And I think that machine learning is going to really help us to quickly understand the functional importance of those particular variants. Then secondly, when we go to the clinic, how are we going to interpret this variation and be able to tailor-make the treatment for the patient when there's so much variation within an individual, both common variants and rare variants? And so clinical design, or clinical trial design is an area that is becoming very important, where AI is playing an important role in being able to do the inclusion and exclusion criteria and having biomarkers for drug efficacy. In particular, when you are doing bridging studies from a drug discovered in the global north in a different population and you're going to a different population, whether you're coming from Europe to Africa or from Asia to Africa or vice versa, those studies are going to be critically important, and I really think that AI and machine learning is going to be an important player there. So I'm just saying, can AI lower these implementation barriers? And so a lot is happening. It's very young work going on, but what we have now understood that you need to have a multi-omic approach, where you're looking at the genetic variation, you're looking at the proteomic variation, you're looking at epigenetic factors, you're looking at the metabolic factors. But as you do that, the data complexity becomes daunting, because it's no more simple correlations, simple multivariant analysis. And I think that this is the home where Bruce and Tim can really start to change things. The data complexity and also standardizing that data is becoming a problem. But there are now good success stories in the use of antidepressants and in cancer drugs. That's where a number of models have actually been taken to and approved by FDA into the clinic. And the idea is, how do you correlate this multi-omic variation with the response in terms of drug safety, adverse drug reactions, and dose recommendations? And making those models that make sense is a big challenge, because some of the models are black box. You just have a good answer, but you don't know how you got there. And you don't know how to convince the patient, and the doctor themselves, they do not have the confidence to understand the use of this type of model. So the idea is to have a system that allows you to then come up with clinical decision support systems that make clinical sense. But the idea is, how do you validate them? You have to go back to real life situations where you now sort of say, okay, I've come up with this model. Can I keep testing in real life situations? And you keep doing that until the model starts to have a clinical translatable sort of basis, so that people can understand why they are doing the changes. And I think that what has been happening over the years is that the genomics itself has been going much faster, but the AI-driven tools only started to appear 2022. So that's when FDA registered one of the tools. And that is mostly to do with optimizing cancer treatment. And most recently in 2025, they have now come up with large language models to try to help the clinicians choose drugs better, also combining the genetic information as well as the clinical notes. Because to bring those together is not a trivial matter, because the doctor understands better their notes. They don't understand a lot about thousands and thousands of DNA sequence variation. How do you bring this together? So FDA has been approving some of these models, and I think this is an area we can enter and make a difference. And I hope Bruce can also speak a little bit to that. But I think we have the resource in terms of genetic variation, and we have the clinical challenge, which needs a solution, and the tool AI and machine learning can really go a long way to address that. And the issue of data, in terms of challenges and opportunities, I'm just rounding up soon, is that When you look at genetic information which is available, there's underrepresentation of African genetics. And we did an analysis of published data, and you can see that African data is only 2.7%. And this really means that you are starting with limited material, and we need to do more. So we have now just started a consortium for genomics and therapeutics in Africa, involving 10 countries, where we are now looking at about 10,000 patients who are on different drugs and have different genes we are looking at, drug-gene interaction pairs, and we hope that that data becomes the resource we need for our generating the models we need to be more predictive, and in different parts of Africa. So those countries were chosen based on cluster of genetic similarities on the continent. So that hopefully will help us to come up with more predictive models for the future. But when you now have the models, the issue is, do you have the regulatory framework that can accept and implement this kind of solutions? So we have been working a lot with regulators in different parts of Africa to try to prepare them for this coming precision medicine solution-based therapy. And we have been working with the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization people to sort of say, can we come up with drug policies that integrate Africa's genomic diversity? And I'm happy to say that, we are making good progress. And just a week ago, I was in Mombasa, where the African Medicines Agency was actually formed, and we were presenting this idea that one of the things they need to tackle is the suitability of drugs being registered in our genomically diverse space when they are coming from a different genomic background where the clinical trials have been done. And we published a policy brief where we are trying to see how best we can move in that particular direction. So I just want to conclude by thanking all the, usually when you come and you present, this is work done by many students, many collaborators, and in particular, I want to thank my colleagues at SBIMB. We have really created a robust and dynamic environment where we are able to do all this work we are doing. And I also want to thank my team, where we try to put all this information together. And so I'll stop here, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Hi, everyone. So when Aletta asked us to speak, she said, can you say some crazy, controversial things? Everything Collen said was very sensible, so I guess that's up to me to say the crazy things. I'm also going to try and keep it short because I'm really keen to listen to the panel. And of course, we can chat afterwards. So I'd like to go back to 2019. You may remember that. The days just before COVID. Okay, the weekend before COVID and after COVID, crazy times. 2019 was also a kind of watershed moment for something that you might not know about, GPT-2. This was before the Gutenberg moment for ChatGPT. And I encourage you to go and play with it. You can find it online to do a demo. And I was going to do a demo, but this isn't my laptop. But I did prepare a prompt. So this was my prompt. What is the most powerful thing about AI? And then in about a minute, what it said was, you have two possibilities here. You can be a jerk and claim it's the most powerful thing about AI. Okay. Or you can be a jerk and claim that it's not. So the point about this is just how far we've come. So earlier this year, Google DeepMind released Gemini 3, and this was a prompt that was given to Gemini 3. It's a mathematics thing, question let end on it, the set of positive integers, and this was the response, or the start of the response. Oh, okay, we want to determine the smallest real constant C, and it goes on for a couple of pages, giving a perfect mathematical proof. Just incredible how far we've come in 6 years. And in fact, both DeepMind, Google DeepMind, and OpenAI won gold medals at the International Maths Olympiad, which is extraordinary. Very, very few people can win a Nobel Prize. Forget Nobel Prize. Gold medals at the International Maths Olympiad. What's extraordinary about this is the models were not trained for mathematics particularly. These are just generic models, just happen to be incredibly good at coding and mathematics. One of the things I think is incredibly powerful about these models is their ability to translate between different disciplines. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of work in healthcare recently, and I would not be able to do that if I didn't have AI to translate for me. So, there'll be a statement, oh, hemoptysis. I'll be like, I have no idea what that is. But, 10 seconds later, I can act like I actually understand. But so I think this ability to translate, so as a joke, I asked ChatGPT to translate this mathematical statement into something for a health sciences researcher. I think this joke aside is incredibly profound, because we understand, if you want to work with a Chinese colleague, the language might be a barrier. But we don't think of that in terms of healthcare and architecture or archaeology and physics. But it's real, it's really there, and it's kept universities siloed, and the potential is not unlocked. And I think AI can perform this incredibly valuable task of allowing people to work together. So, data to diagnosis. So the first aspect of data is around research. I'd like to talk about the rise of the AI scientist. Sorry, we've been working really hard. You can see some of my colleagues, we've been at it since 8 in the morning, working very, very hard. So I will probably stumble a bit, so forgive me. So here's a plot. There's a thing called the RE bench, which tracks R&D in AI, research and development. And you can see there, there are several curves. The one that are more flat were the best AIs last year, November last year. And you can see that they score as you give them more time to think. So that's the horizontal x-axis is how much time they're given to. You can see they rise quite slowly, but the fast riser is the human node. Okay, so that's saying is, AI might win on the short term, it's quick, but if you give it a bit longer, humans beat it at research and development. Well, last week, that was broken. For the first time, we have an AI that's better than humans, and we mean expert researchers in AI. We don't just mean someone on the street. This is expert researchers in AI are now being beaten by AI. And what this is partly driven by is a result that you can ask, as you make the task bigger and longer, the probability that the AI can get to the end without making a mistake drops quickly. But what we're seeing is that maximum length of time that the AI can work without screwing up is doubling every roughly 7 months. So currently, the best model is GPT Codex. It can work on average for about 2.75 hours successfully. But that's doubling every 7 months. So in a year, you're getting 4x improvement. In 2 years, you're getting 16x improvement. In 5 years, you're getting roughly 1,000x improvement. So if this law holds, and there's no reason it should, but also no reason it shouldn't, in 5 years, we'd expect AI to be able to do at least 1,000 hours of consecutive work without falling over. So you can imagine what that means in terms of science, scientific research. So that's the one element. The other is automating biosciences labs. So Emerald Cloud Lab is an example. They advertise themselves as a fully software-controlled, highly automated life sciences lab that allows scientists to design, execute, and analyze experiments remotely from anywhere on Earth. And for any computer scientists in the room, I would call this life sciences by API. You sort of just send a request, it does the experiment for you, you get the data back. When you look on Google Maps and you say, what's the shortest route from here to Rosebank? That's an API request. You send to Google, hey, give me the shortest route, and it sends it back, and you pay something a little bit in some way or another. Here, the request would trigger off a robotic machine running lab tests, and then what you get back is the data. So now you start to think, okay, wait a minute, what happens if we combine these? They're talking about scientists running these experiments remotely, but do they have to be human? So actually now you think, okay, we'll take these AI scientists that can now work for longer and longer periods, you connect them up to robotic labs like Emerald Cloud Lab, hopefully the BioHub. Then you hook it into things like AlphaFold, which can do simulations in silicon. Oh, like we don't want to do a wet lab experiment. Let's do a computer experiment. And what you end up with is 24/7 research and development. Right? So this is quite an amazing combination, I think. So Demis Hassabis, who won the Nobel Prize last year, he was on a very interesting 60 Minutes interview. And I know for those of you who are not yet sick of seeing me speak, have seen this a few times, but I think it's just so extraordinary. He said on this interview, it would revolutionize human health, AI in other words, and I think one day we may cure all disease with the help of AI. And the interviewer says, the end of disease? And he says, I think that's within reach, maybe within the next decade or so. I don't see why not. And I think it's exactly driven by this recipe with essentially no humans involved. That's the key thing. There are no humans there. It's all fully automated. They don't have to take a break. They don't get tired. They don't get to December and think, wow, it's been a long year. I really could take a break. So, you know, I think in terms of research, this is an incredibly profound paradigm. And in fact, just yesterday, the White House announced the Genesis mission. Great name. This executive order launches the Genesis mission as a dedicated, coordinated national effort to unleash a new age of AI-accelerated innovation and discovery, not just in healthcare, it's across all areas. Because of course, the model I put up there had nothing to do specifically with health sciences. It's automated labs, AI scientists, and digital simulations. I mean, that's just completely generic, right? And they want to centralize these resources for maximum effect. So that's what I think is happening in the next couple of years in terms of research. And of course, the subtext is, okay, what do we do about it? Which we can pick up on the panel. Now, diagnosis, the other thing that is in the title. Well, this is the kind of schematic of the scientific method, which these labs that we would think would be taught. You have a hypothesis about what drives cancer, or why the moon is made of cheese, whatever your hypothesis is. You design a test to an experiment to check your hypothesis. Then you analyze the results and you update your hypothesis. And then you just go round and round the circle. That's what science is, right? And the winners are the ones who go around that circle faster than anyone else. Well, what I've learned, little as it is, about clinical diagnosis is that it's actually quite similar. You have a hypothesis, a differential diagnosis of what the patient may be suffering from. You do tests and investigations, and based on that, you decide on treatment, and then that updates your ongoing problem list, your ongoing differential diagnosis. And then you go around that. And if you go around that fast enough, patient gets better. So in fact, I think there's an incredible parallel between these two. Treatment of patients and scientific discovery can actually be viewed as the same or essentially very similar cycle. And if you can do that, you can use AI. So I'll give you some example. Funded by Gates, we've been doing a really nice study, and Ismail and Harun are also here, who are the PIs on this project. And we've been looking at hundreds of multimodal cases. Multimodal means X-rays, MRIs, CT scans, and we've been giving it to AI models and seeing whether they can correctly diagnose. So this was one that I thought was really interesting. So this is a CT angio. It almost sounds like I know what I'm talking about. But the key thing is the AI models are getting so good that we can't just ask one physician. We have to have an expert panel to evaluate because the models are so good. And the panel looked at the radiology report, and the radiology report, no filling defects. So there's nothing to suggest pulmonary embolism. So the panel went with that and said, yeah, no pulmonary embolism. The way that we run these panels is that after they've made their diagnosis, we show them what the large language model said. And then we ask them to score it. And in this case, the LLM said, there's definitely a pulmonary embolism. And the expert panel was like, oh, actually, it caused us to go back and look at the CT scan, and we actually did find the pulmonary embolus. So that was a lovely example of just how good these AI models get, that even with an expert panel, sometimes the expert panel is wrong. And then just, I can't show you any ongoing result. We're just about to have the exciting results, but we don't quite have them. But in a preliminary work, we studied going from Gemini 2.5 Pro, which was one of the leading models, but Gemini 3 got released a couple of weeks ago. And what we saw was a 5% improvement in going from 2.5 to 3 in terms of overall diagnostic score, a 17% improvement in the clinical reasoning, because we don't just want it to say, oh, tuberculosis, we want to say, why do you think of it? And then a 15% reduction in negative treatment risk. If it got the diagnosis wrong, how bad would it have been for the patient if you treated according to Mahoney? Anyway, I think that's a beautiful study, and I don't have much time, but we're extending that, thanks to Scott and Gates, into sequential AI diagnosis. And it goes back to this. We want to check, what if we put the AI in at every step, not just at the end, but we ask it to manage the patient? Can we actually use AI to manage the patients ongoing? Anyway, I'll jump past this. One of the exciting opportunities around this, I think, is optimizing healthcare against a fixed budget. Humans are very bad at optimization. AI is great at optimization. So then, of course, there's potential fear and a legitimate fear around AI and what it might mean. But what about, how can we just make the lives of people better? And I love this term, removing toil. How can we use AI to reduce toil in life? And when I speak to people, clinicians, one of the worst they always highlight is writing patient consult notes. So they'll talk to a patient and then they have to write notes. And often it's done after hours, and as a result, they miss things, they forget, they have mistakes. And if this hard copy of the notes gets lost, there's no backup, right? And that's a huge medical legal risk. There's no ICD-10 coding. And, South African medical legal claims paid out about 24 billion rand over 2020 to 2023. So it's a huge, this is a lose-lose situation. So the alternate, which I think some people may already know, things like Heidi Health, is to use an ambient scribe, something that, just listens to the conversation, it transcribes it, and then it just makes a soap note out of the audio. And we have been running at UCT with the Neuroscience Institute an ambient scribe trial. We did 50 patient consults and a mixture with post-operative notes. And we compared the handwritten. So we forced the registrars and the consultants to do the old way, and then we did it the new way. And then we had this complicated, torturous thing of scoring both the AI notes and the handwritten notes. And the result was that the AI won 48 out of 50. There was one tie and 0 handwritten notes. We used one of the notes to do prompt optimization and context optimization, so we couldn't use that one. So, and the probability of the handwritten notes actually being better than the AI notes was 10 to the minus 14, right? So we were originally planning to do 100, but it was just insane. We usually think about the threshold for publishing as being, a p-value of 0.05. And this was the results. On the left is the AI, so this is the average SOAP scores, and you can see that the median score for the AI was 5 out of 5, with a couple that were a little bit lower. On the right, you see the handwritten notes, the median was 3, some below 1. Some of the notes were like shockingly bad. And of course, this, depending on who did it, this was saving 5 to 10 minutes of the registrar's time. And of course, the nice thing about this is you get ICD-10 coding as well, which of course the handwritten notes didn't have at all. So I just wanted to make a point about leadership in the age of AI, which I think is really important. So I'll just quickly describe this. In the old days, doing a project would involve some human admin and humans deciding, let's describe it by this green block. Then they would agree, yeah, let's do X. And then they would go away and do it, and that would take a long time. There would be some development of some sort. Then there would be another human phase, another, etc. And so what you would end up with is that you would, the human part of this 22-month-long process was only 4 months. With AI, what we're seeing is this. The development part is shrinking by a factor of 10 to 100, but often the human side is exactly the same. So the key point is that actually the bottleneck is the humans. The humans are now taking 80% of the time for the whole project. So great leadership in the time of AI is dealing with the human bottlenecks, because now that is the main problem. So admin, oh, you got to go follow bureaucracy, you got to go through things. These are now the difference between people who are really going to succeed, and not just people, but teams, organizations. It's now the human side that's the bottleneck. Anyway, I have a lot to, oh, and I just wanted to say, for me, the way the Gates Foundation works is an amazing model of this. It's just completely revolutionized, and it's great. Anyway, that's just, I might be biased. Anyway, I think just as a challenge to the panels, and I was given instructions to add this by Ismail, how do ethics and IP commercialization, how do we keep up with the speed and the complexity of, and the interconnectedness of the teams that we have in this era of AI? You know, there's lots of stakeholders, it's lots of complexity. And then I think just broader ones of how do we train, build, and run high-performance human AI, cross-disciplinary, mission-driven, world-class teams. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and also Collen for your very thought-provoking talks. So while we digest the talks, I'm going to call up on the panelists to join us on stage. So the person who will be moderating the panel, I'm going to call first, and she is no stranger to this faculty, Professor Helen Rees, the Executive Director of WITS RHI. So the next panelist I'm going to call on is Dr. Maurice Goodman. He's the Chief Medical Officer at Discovery Health. Our next panelist is Dr. Aisha Pandor. She's the co-founder and CEO of Pandor Health, an AI platform helping women manage chronic digestive, hormonal, and reproductive diseases. And then our last panelist is from the Gates Foundation. So Dr. Scott Mahoney is a Senior Program Officer with the Global Health Division of the Gates Foundation, where he leads efforts to advance innovative applications of artificial intelligence to improve the quality, access, and equity of healthcare in low and middle income countries. I'm also going to call on Bruce and Collen to join the panel, so in case there are questions.
Honestly, fantastic opening talks, but the one thing I'll just say is by way of introduction as we think about this, and it goes with things like ethics and equity, is, there have been many studies done on what patients want and what practitioners want, and looking at your last study that you presented. And if you say to practitioners, what do you want? They say, well, I want to be efficient, I want to be able to examine, take a history, I want to get a diagnosis, I want a management plan, and time is important. If you say to the patient, what do you want? They say, I want to be listened to. I want to feel that somebody cares about me. The two are not necessarily compatible, and they're certainly not AI friendly. There's a gap. So I'm just thinking that when we think about healthcare, we are thinking about the sort of the human aspect of it and how we come to that. But what I'm going to do first of all is to invite our speakers to just say very briefly, and I'm going to be strict on people with time because we haven't got a lot of time. We've got excellent speakers. So I'm going to ask people to say from your own perspective, from your own backgrounds, having listened to these talks, where do you think AI fits into your current role? And Dr. Maurice Goodman has been introduced from Discovery. You're going to start off for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I must say I'm feeling quite intimidated amongst all these academics and researchers. I'm not an academic or a researcher, and although I love working with them. So my focus will be Discovery Health is obviously a health funder here in South Africa, and also through our Vitality program, works on positive behavioral modification kind of globally. So I thought maybe just to bring us, just to ground us a bit, and just to show how AI is playing out locally and how it works, I just thought I'd read you. We're about to send out this week our year-end letter to the treating clinicians that we work with. And just the opening sentence, I think maybe kind of sets the scene. We just said, globally and in South Africa, artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies are transforming healthcare. These innovations are unlocking new possibilities clinically and administratively. Bruce talked about ambient scribes, etc. By empowering healthcare professionals at the forefront of care and enabling patients to become more active participants in their own healthcare. So I think that's, if you talk about how all of these things are playing out practically, I think that kind of sets the scene. And we've come up with there is some overlap, but with a 6-letter alliteration, I think it is in P's, how we see healthcare becoming through AI is precise, personalized, predictive, preventive, proactive, and participative. And that's the way we see it really transforming healthcare. And with non-communicable diseases becoming the leading cause of morbidity and mortality, patient participation and predictive capabilities really become more and more important. So we launched here, and we can talk about it, personal health pathways, which for each of our over 2 million members provides them with a personal kind of next best actions and how to navigate the complex healthcare journey. And we've just partnered with Google globally through Vitality AI to kind of do that globally. So that's one area I'd like to focus on. The other is really, if you look at treating clinicians, there's a totally new way of practicing. And for me, although it's not a new book, Dr. Eric Topol, I think in 2015, wrote a book called The Patient Will See You Now. And in it, he describes what he calls a Gutenberg moment about democratizing medical information and tools. And for many of us who trained in the era where the of information asymmetry, where the doctor was the font and the source of all knowledge, that's turned around. Often patients living with chronic illnesses will come into a consult knowing more about the latest research than the doctor does. And how does the treating clinician kind of cope with that? Learn to work in multidisciplinary teams where the patient, in fact, is an active participant in that team and not a passive recipient of care. And so that has huge implications for how we train future doctors. It has ethical implications, medical, legal implications. And then maybe just the last topic, but I think Scott's probably much better positioned to talk about that, is around health equity. These technologies in the global north, we've talked about how they can transform healthcare, but really if you think about resource-poor communities, the opportunity there for smashing the so-called iron triangle of healthcare, cost, quality, access. I mean, these can have huge transformational abilities in resource-poor communities, and that's very exciting, but it's the most challenging area for reasons we can explore. So for me, those are the three kind of seminal topics.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask everyone in the audience, how many of you got some sort of smart device on your wrists? Either that you look at or that you submit. You see? Okay, I haven't. Right, Aisha, your background is completely different, so I'd like to hear your perspective on this.
So I come to the discussion from the context of a I guess, a genetics research student who was an okay student, but I think the thing that where I stood out was just being very, very impatient and very, very high risk tolerance. And so left academia, became an entrepreneur, started a company called Sweep South, and then through my own experience with a chronic health condition, started a company called Pandor Health. And so have a sort of founder's perspective as someone who's building in AI and healthcare. And with Pandora Health, what we do is we work with women who have chronic health conditions. We collect data around symptoms, but we also look at the priorities of patients, of the users. And so, you know, two or more people who have the same condition may have very different priorities in what they're trying to look for out of treatment. So we collect information around symptoms, we layer that with information from blood labs, microbiome test kit results, and then use that to provide guidance both to users but also to their care teams around what holistic health and what their healthcare care plans should look like. I also, having dealt with a chronic health condition, endometriosis, and sort of felt frustration at how little is understood about this condition, which affects 10% of women, come from, or sort of look at my work as a founder from the perspective of a patient as well, and from a woman where, you know, we're drastically underrepresented in healthcare. For the last century have sort of been viewed as mini versions of men, where having an extra chromosome is seen as a complication. And then I also come from the perspective of an African and sort of thinking about data and not just access and equity, but also sort of who's driving healthcare agendas, who's funding innovation. When Bruce showed that awesome picture of the automated lab, it made me think of another company in the US called In Citro, who are a data-driven drug discovery company. And they're doing incredible things in metabolic disease and neurological disease, but they have raised $600 million in funding to do it. And so I think about, you know, who's going to fund all of this research and innovation as well. You know, when you think about commercializing, where are the incentives to commercialize? And then I also come to the discussion as an investor in healthcare. So as an entrepreneur, I've also looked to invest in other healthcare entrepreneurs. And so just two examples of companies that we've invested in. One is Vula Mobile, they're now called Vula Health, who collect patients in under-resourced areas to specialists. And are sort of trying to use AI to determine how to make those connections more efficient. And then I'm also an advisor for a company called SkinSight that is trying to better risk stratify and diagnose for skin health conditions using your mobile phone for people with darker skin color, where it's often difficult to do so. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, Scott, we've heard a lot about Gates. Gates is a huge funder in this space. So tell us about what you're doing. But the mention was also made about equity. And this has been a priority for Gates. So over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Prof. Rees. And yeah, it's been an incredible journey watching how the foundation has really tried to support the work being done by incredible partners, especially in the Global South. The foundation's made, you know, well over $100 million worth of investment in AI across agriculture, education, which are important social determinants of health as well, which we often forget that. And we try and ground ourselves in the principle that a woman who needs health advice is also potentially a small-scale farmer and educator of her children. And so trying to actually see where we can pair interventions and reach people where they are. Obviously, the foundation, with, you know, recent announcements, has a 20-year laser focus, you know, until we sunset, and our chair has committed to spending down wealth over those 20 years. Our key focus areas is driving down under 5 mortality, driving down maternal and newborn deaths, and then obviously reducing infectious disease impacts as well. we really try and operate, and Bruce, thank you so much for the comments, but we try and operate as really as partners to human potential. I think we operate a little bit differently as a funder, and we really try and drive that strong partnership with great partners to try and capitalize on this human potential. And interestingly, obviously, AI is also a huge catalyst to human potential as well. So where do we see the potential for AI within the foundation, and how do we match this with the need for responsible, equitable, and ethical balance when exploring these, and in addition, sustainability models that go with this for governments to take over these programs or bodies of work? I think there's two kind of big buckets that we can start to focus in on around AI and health in particular. One is around trying to optimize for improved quality of care. And we know from the kind of Lancet's Global Health Report 2050, in driving down premature deaths by half by 2050, there's 7 non-communicable diseases, 8 infectious diseases, and a list of interventions that could be enacted there, that simply by improving quality of care, we are able to drive down premature deaths by 50%. So speaking to being able to make sure that we are providing that quality of care for a patient, and as you mentioned, that patient gets heard, is really important. And so there's a few ways that we're approaching this, but maybe just to touch on the second bucket is how we approach managing the quantum of care that is required. I think Prof. Masimirembwa mentioned on his opening slide that 25% of the health burden is borne by Africa. The stark and real truth nugget here is that only 3% of the health workforce is in Africa. So, how do we balance that massive disparity and inequality? And so if we look at that quantum of care, there's opportunities to try and catalyze and support healthcare workers on the ground at the front line, whether that's healthcare promoters in Kenya, community healthcare workers in South Africa, and also primary healthcare services in the public service in many of the countries across the continent. I think importantly, another factor which I'm sure we'll cover is how we improve the introduction of AI within undergraduate and medical professions training. And we've very proudly worked with WITS on some of this work as well as exploratory. And I think the stark, sobering fact is that even if fantastic organizations, universities, training institutions like WITS across the continent ran at full tilt, we're still sitting with a 12 million healthcare worker shortage by 2030, which is 5 years away, less than it takes to train a doctor. And so if we can catalyze improving the quality of care and the quantity of care that can be delivered, we can start to reach people. We can start to make an impact in their lives across the care continuum. And I think the last thing just to add in here is that AI, and Prof. Rees, you mentioned, people who have wearables on their wrist. Everyone in this room, or probably most of the people in this room have smartphones as well. That is not the case across the continent. And so how do we utilize AI as a reach extender to give people the right information at the right time and at the right place, and then connect them to the physical commodities that they need? So I think, matching that with the fact that so many people live, 1 in 6 people live, I think, more than an hour away from a healthcare facility. That's 1 billion people on this planet. And so how do we extend that reach? And so these are kind of priority areas that we're trying to look at and to see how we can improve health systems delivery. And I think there are a lot of underpinning benchmarking evaluation approaches that need to be done to support that as well.
No, thank you. And I think what you're all describing so far, in fact, all of you have described, is this extraordinary, rapid, fundamental change in the way that we're going to have to deliver health services. We're already starting to see it, but what we're saying is we will, and we are transferring much more responsibility to individuals. But in the African region, what you just said, Scott, is how viable is that? So I'm going to come, Collen, to you. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But sitting there and thinking in a regulatory framework, I was wondering, I could imagine that for many drugs now, you almost say, well, you need to know your own genome before you can take this drug. How are we thinking about translating what you've just presented into something that is viable in the African context for so many health products?
that is a very tough sort of thing to address. And I think that's why this panel discussion can offer us a window, because if we look at traditional models of scaling, whether it is drug discovery or diagnostics discovery and development, the methods that have been used before, they are all not almost practical. To discover a drug, if it is taking 10 to 15 years and is costing a couple of $1 billion, then Africa's investment capacity cannot handle that. If we look at diagnostic tests, again, most drugs require a companion diagnostic test. So I'm thinking that we are sitting at a time where alternative models should be used to try to make it both affordable and in the shortest possible time, because we cannot continue extending the opportunity for Africans to have a better life. Right now, the life expectancy is around 64, and in Europe it's in the 80s and it keeps increasing. So I think that the use of AI, in particular in drug discovery, how can we reduce cost and reduce the time? And I think programs like the Grand Challenges Africa Drug Discovery Accelerator, which again is funded by the Gates, is really looking at how we can look at our priority diseases, infectious diseases, and bring products to the market faster, and malaria and tuberculosis. But I think that there is a need to also look at non-communicable diseases, which are creating a double burden for Africa, as if it's not enough to have the infectious diseases. So I think that the use of AI will help us to map the disease spreading patterns and understand how best to tackle them. If you look at the gene drive approaches, which are being tested in Tanzania to try to address malaria, I really think that these things are going to be revolutionary in ways we had not thought about, because before we were thinking about a vaccine, and a vaccine for malaria has not been forthcoming. But I think if we can terminate the life cycle and reduce infection rates faster, that would be the best way to go. If you look at diagnostics, right now we are importing all these diagnostic tests, and because of this genetic variation, most of those diagnostic tests are not going to give the right information to the doctor to give the right treatment. So, and I believe that the generation of more data, genomic data, and I think Ambrose from UCT was now proposing 3 million genomes to be sequenced. So we need, for us to move faster, we need more data so that the models are carrying the information that is relevant to us. Because if we develop most models now informed by data from the global north, they will probably not give us the solutions we want. So I think that the best way is to generate more data that will inform the different models we are going to be developing. And that way I think we will have better path to access and affordable access, so to speak. Yeah.
Bruce, my question for you was indeed what Scott also said, which you've got MIND, which is, really world-class institution. How are we going to accommodate training of healthcare workers in the context of the data, for example, that you've just shown us? And one thing for you is, if you can go and look things up so quickly, how much do people need to learn? Yeah, because all of us spend hours and hours learning.
Yeah. So actually, Helen, I'd like to respond to your first shot across the bow when you said that we mustn't sacrifice patient experience just to make the life of clinicians better. And I think it's really important. One interesting thing about ambient scribes, and I've experienced this as a patient, is that I think the physicians are much more present with me because they're not having to try to scribble while I'm talking. So I think it's a really important point. We can't have it that AI actually makes the life of patients worse, or the experience of patients worse. To your question, I have no idea what the future of education looks like. Again, Scott alluded to it. We did do a small, Haruna was the PI on this, we did do a small trial of allowing medical students to use AI during a mock OSCE. We found that it didn't make any difference. we believe that's training, though, that when if the students had more experience with using this tool, because in a sense there's a context switching. You've got a patient in front of you, and you've got AI, and you've got to try to juggle. So it's a bit like learning to ride a bike. If you don't know how to ride a bike, having a bike doesn't help you go anywhere faster, right? All you do is run next to the bike, dragging it along, right? You have to learn how to ride a bike. So I think that is key, is how to be, and I kind of alluded to it, how do you work with AI like you would a team member? There's a real skill set. How to complement AI. So I think, and the problem, of course, is AI is changing so fast that it's a moving target as well. So I think it's critical. I think I love the model of taking away toil. You're exhausted, you see a mysterious case in front of you, AI can help avoid mistakes, can help guide you, support you. So I think having AI being really supportive, but it's really tricky, right? I don't know how to make shoes, right? Hand making shoes, just not a skill I have. And that's okay, probably, because we can just buy factory created. So I think the real question about the soul of what is education is up for grabs. And I don't think anybody knows. So in a way, you could say the real question is, how do we continue educating people given that we don't know where things are going to be in 10 years? So how do we deal with the uncertainty and not make bad decisions? And yeah, I think it's very hard. I think in a sense in Africa it's kind of fortuitous because we know we have such a shortage, we should just go full in anyway. Whereas in other places there might be more concern about job losses, etc. Yeah.
I just as you were talking, Bruce, I was thinking about incentive and incentivizing young people to get involved in using AI to solve problems. And again, I think about my own journey, and it's sort of like, well, what are you really, really interested in trying to solve, and what will influence you or sort of get you excited about using these tools that are otherwise unfamiliar? Because I think if you put AI in the hands of someone and just say, well, here it is, use it. Yeah, it's, well, what for? So I think that, and again, going to the example of in vitro, where one of the things that they've pioneered is these multidisciplinary teams of young people who've come out of universities, and the only reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason why they've agreed to work together is because they've given them this sort of big, hairy, audacious goal of being able to solve drug discovery much faster than anyone else on the planet. So, you now have data scientists who's sitting with biologists and learning from them and people, and her, Daphne Koller, the CEO, her sort of mantra is, we'll put people in a room and we'll lock them in that room until they learn how to work together. And so I think just, giving people something exciting and big and compelling to work on is one thing. And then I think from an incentive perspective, to some of the points that Collen was making, I mean, I do, having moved sort of very much as a founder who has to fundraise, and as an investor, a VC investor who companies pitch to, I've had to really just think with a very commercial lens when I think about these things. And so, how do you get drug companies to implement these tests? So how do you get these tests in practice? It's like, well, what's the incentive? Is it that you're going to market that your test has less adverse events, or is going to result in a shorter hospital stay, or whatever the case is? It's, I always go back to sort of what's the commercial incentive, and it's not always the best way to think about the world from a very sort of capitalistic perspective, but I think that is also a reality. And then the last thing is just patient advocacy, and educating and allowing patients to say to their doctors, their health teams, I prefer this over that because that's going to be cheaper, or there's higher efficacy or whatever, which does obviously mean that patients have to be educated, feel like they can advocate for themselves. So
I think for me, the point is that the way forward is really the kind of learning of the so-called softer skills, the teamwork, as I said up front, accepting the patient as a member of the team, multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. I mean, again, doctors from my day, you were a clinician and you worked by yourself. The ability to work with data scientists, with actuaries, with other people who typically didn't have a place in kind of frontline healthcare. I think that teamwork is really those so-called softer skills. I think that's really what needs to be taught. I mean, again, in our day, the smartest guy was the guy who could quote page 78 of Harrison's out of his head when, on the ward round. Now, you don't need to know that anymore. So the information really has become democratized, and I think it's the working together, the softer skills that really need to be taught.
I want to ask all of you from your own very varied perspectives. We haven't used the word yet, leapfrogging. But if you think about our continent, we have to take all of these lessons learned and actually say, how do we rapidly take them to people to improve healthcare? So from your own perspectives, if you were going to say what would be a sort of priority area, I mean, some of you, Scott, you've touched on it already. What would you prioritize to say leapfrog in terms of the technologies? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to go after you.
Collen?
Well, I have a keen interest in diagnosis, and I think that AI has been extremely successful in predicting things, different images, and in TB, in particular diagnosis. And I think given the number of people who have these infections and the risk of wrong diagnosis and the importance of early diagnosis to get the type of care you want, I think it would be truly impactful if we can, in this area, shorten the time that you can get your diagnosis and they have the right diagnosis, which will lead to the right treatment, because there are a lot of errors that are happening in that area where sometimes people are given the wrong diagnosis. And even if they get the right diagnosis, they're given the wrong drugs because you do not understand the profile for drug resistance and things like that. So I think in diagnosis, I think we can make better use of the medicines that are there. I feel they're not being optimally used in our time.
Thank you. Scott?
I'm going to dive into 2 or 3 potential leapfrogs here, if I may. I think as we think about the future of AI in health systems, I studied about half an hour up the road here. I won't mention that university in case there's any, but essentially I remember doing 6 months of a specific language course and learned Tswana and learned to speak Tswana. And my kind of understanding now is that actually we are moving into a space where people, especially in South Africa, if I are working in the medical sense, are probably beneficial speaking at least an alternative language beyond English, but also the language of AI and data, and understanding the reasoning behind the institution of these kinds of tooling within clinical practice. And I think we need to do work in that space. I think we need to be able to explain to healthcare workers why being able to collect longitudinal data on patients is so important in being able to predict their future outcomes and being able to predict, potential new diagnoses that may emerge. There's obviously many ways to configure that, but I think leapfrogs for me, the one that really gets me excited is that AI is actually an opportunity for the African continent in particular to jump forth into the world of health intelligence. At present, we see varying levels of digital maturity within public health systems. And I think there's lots to learn from the private health sector in South Africa in particular and many adjacent countries. We've seen the evolutions of electronic medical records, electronic health records, patient management apps, and we've seen large role players in the health industry and providers make large investments in these platforms. The simple truth is that these require at each step a behavior change for those providers and a level of acceptance and trust by the patients as well. We're now seeing a lot of these EMRs and EHRs start embedding modules of ambient scribing tools. And the reasoning behind this is actually we need to be able to grease the wheels of data collection. In order to have a level of health intelligence, we need to have rich data. There's the very old adage I'm sure most people have heard, garbage in, garbage out. And so if we are able to improve the quality of data we're capturing into health systems, we are already at a massive win. And so I think there's been many pilots across the continent, and in fact it's been termed pilotitis in the digital health era. And we've seen digital tools with drop-down menus, etc., for data collection, and they've made drastic impacts. But the ability to now institute ambient scribing, and I think the one thing to add here is what we're seeing in the model's performance in terms of code switching and low resource language identification is absolutely phenomenal. To really drive this home, 3 months ago was at Red Cross Children's Hospital with the head of pediatrics and asked him, Professor Rizzani, to have a look at Chivenda, spoken by 1.2 to 1.5 million people on the continent. It wouldn't answer in Chivenda in terms of real-time voice. 3 weeks later, it actually performed flawlessly in a primary healthcare setting. So I think those leapfrog opportunities are there. And I think it's up to us to be able to tap into those and really drive the human potential that we see on the continent.
Yeah, maybe part of leapfrogging also has to do with the fact that we don't have any choice except to look at sort of need-based innovation. When I think about SkinSight, the company that I'm advising, that is meant to sort of help patients and dermatologists, I was shocked when before today, just try to have a quick look at the number of dermatologists in South Africa, and seeing that I think it's like 300 or 400 in the entire country. And so there's just no way that you're going to have 5 dermatologists per million people catering to all of the needs that South Africans have, from sort of ordinary skin conditions all the way to skin cancer. And so we just have to find better ways to care for people. And so this is where I think innovation can be. It's not about, I have a South African and I've been living in the US for the last 3 years, and innovation's not just about what's sort of sexy and, bettering X next company. It's about what we need to deliver care to people. I also think about community and the fact that, we live within communities, we engage more, we're hopefully less lonely than more sort of economically developed markets. And so I think about the power of community in delivering healthcare. And again, with the perspective, with a woman's health perspective, whether it's maternal health or thinking about perimenopause and menopause, and just not just a sort of top-down approach to healthcare, but people being able to support and educate each other. And then devices, and in the absence of sort of big budgets for sort of fancy devices, I just think about all of the different applications of smartphones, from geolocation to, being able to take pictures and analyze pictures to, communication, but just really stripping down all of these devices to what are the different components and how can we absolutely sweat all of those from a healthcare perspective.
Yeah, so for me, the smallness of our system actually is something that we can turn to our advantage. I mean, Aisha talked about, a few hundred dermatologists. I think in terms of medical oncologists, I think there are about 10 in the whole country. There are more specialists in Cleveland Clinic than there are in the whole country. So that's a problem. On the other hand, the smallness of the system means it's a system we can change. I mean, if you think of changing the healthcare system in the US, it's impossible, it's just too big. Whereas here, we all kind of know each other. And I think that very smallness of the system and the ability to work together, we can change a system, and that can really be a blueprint for the world.
And just for you, from the Discovery point of view, Discovery has been very advanced in using your data. And I think we also heard from Collen about the importance of using data to be able to predict more accurate diagnostics. I mean, is there any lesson from discovery that you would say would contribute to a leapfrogging concept?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the company was started by actuaries, not. But what that did build into the DNA was the obsession about collecting data, and that's we now have more than 60 million life years of, and it's all kind of data. It's health data, it's wellness data. It's Lish talked about behavioral modification. One needs to understand people's propensity to change. I mean, we talk about incentivizing people to different things. Different people are motivated by different incentives. And so it's really about really obsessing about the data, collecting it all, and then now what AI can do, and it's been a feature of our partnership with Google, is really bring these disparate data sets together and really get meaningful behavioral modification. We talked about, even on the African continent now, I think the non-communicable diseases have overtaken the communicable diseases in terms of morbidity and mortality drivers, and behavioral modification to prevent the onset or manage secondary or tertiary prevention. So understanding people's behavior, putting that together with their kind of wellness activities, really using AI to bring together these so-called disparate data sets is really very powerful.
And I think we all liked your last finding about lots of sleep. That was a good one. I think we all enjoyed that. Bruce?
So yeah, I think all the good stuff has been said. In terms of leapfrogging, I think, I think what our study has shown is that AI is really getting to the point where it's incredibly good at supporting, diagnosis and management. But there has been some research that shows that if the person prompting the model is not qualified or trained, often they get much poorer results. So I think in terms of the obvious thing is, healthcare, if everyone could get hold of a cell phone and get access to AI, in principle, that should be revolutionary for healthcare. But then there's this challenge of it goes back to education. How do we make sure people are asking the right questions? They're not leaving out important things. I don't have an answer. Maybe the one thing I think is incredibly positive is that if we think what AI might do in terms of massive job losses, right? I think everyone will be incentivized to become entrepreneurial. I think there'll be a massive push towards entrepreneurship. And I think in many communities in Africa, that's much more of a way of life than it is in Switzerland and Geneva, right? For example. So I think there is a potential for leapfrogging, not specifically healthcare, but using AI to drive entrepreneurship, opportunity, and healthcare will be a really important component of that. So I think that's an exciting thing. And then the question is, how do we empower people? Often when I'm on an Uber, I will direct the conversation towards, do you know that WhatsApp has AI in it? And you could use it to develop a business plan for yourself and create a logo for your business. And people are often completely shocked that they have this power in their fingers. So I think that's a challenge, I think. How do we utilize the natural entrepreneurship in Africa to leapfrog more broadly than just healthcare?
And while you've got the mic, what I want to hear from everyone is, what do you think is the biggest ethical risk, the biggest ethical challenge? You can only have one, Scott, not three. One.
Well, if I can go first, I will say if we just see exponential growth of AI. So if AI progress continues for the next 20 years like it has been, I have no idea what the future of humanity is. So I think there are lots of smaller scale ethical questions, but I think there's an existential question. And it may just be that humans evolve into a completely different species almost, But I think there's profound risks and benefits, incredibly deep ones. So with that, I'll sign off.
And I'm going to come to Collen, but none of us have mentioned regulation. But still, let's stick on ethics. Collen.
Yes. So, I mean, just to build on what Bruce has said, is that humans, we normally work on precedent. We set our rules and regulations based on our experience and our knowledge. But here we are faced with something we have no way of knowing where it's going to go. So the ethical frameworks are always lagging behind. So the fear of the unknown is really the ethical dilemma we have, because we cannot control, regulate something which we do not know exactly the way it is going to progress. And I think we need to change our mindsets and allow ourselves to be more risk-taking, and believe that it will take us to a better place. But that is not human-like. The human desire is to know how every step is going to work. So ethics, we see it in genomics, that some of the rules and regulations that came were almost making it impossible to move forward. And even now, when we think we are more liberal in terms of our thought process, we still create barriers for ourselves. So for me, the ethical dilemma is the human mindset on how to accommodate an unknown future.
Thank you. Scott.
I'm going to try and limit it to one bullet point. It may be a long bullet point, though. I think the one thing that doesn't get spoken about enough around AI and health is accountability. Who takes accountability when things go wrong? I think we do focus in a lot on what goes right, how things can, change massively in the health systems and health structure. I think, looking at a lot of the guidelines and also speaking to some of the regulation, we see that there's an acknowledgement that while these tools are implemented in provider-facing interfaces, there's an expectation that those providers take accountability for the outputs of AI tools, which I think is a good way to also improve the behavior change and the vetting of these tools. I think, though, speaking to the potential of AI and its extreme performance in things like diagnostic and treatment accuracy planning, we're going to see a leapfrog shift into opportunities for patients to start getting treatment plans, diagnoses directly for themselves around, self-care. I think for me, this is where the ethical concern comes in, is who takes accountability at that point. Because, in an ideal world, you are able to have a doctor in your pocket and you can get your answers at the right time and right place. There are some fantastic organizations that are working around how to mitigate for this accountability. I think of organizations like MyMDoc, who are Nigeria-based and doing incredible work in screening the risk of conversations from what the patient is saying versus what the AI is saying back to them, and being able to kind of label those conversations and escalate them to humans. The fact remains is, and I think in terms of job creation downstream, I think of all of the unemployed doctors in South Africa, the opportunity to have human-in-the-loop curators and sort of fact-checkers on these conversations is perhaps a potential solution. How that configures, how it works, yet to be resolved. But I think that accountability piece is incredibly important.
Aisha?
So I think there are two things that are tied to each other. So going back to incentive and what are the incentives for the people who are developing models, who are benefiting from AI ultimately, and does that create more of an inequality gap? And so it's very weird to sort of look at the two extremes, where on the one hand you have mega billionaires talking about buying more compute power and GPUs, and then on the other hand you have a reducing percentage of young people who are able to read for comprehension, let alone use AI. And I'm always very suspicious when I hear people talk about things like a universal basic income and AI is going to replace all our jobs, but don't worry, we'll have a universal basic income. Because my first company looked at helping women access work opportunities, women who are domestic workers, who carers, and through that we really recognized the importance of doing work that's productive, of being able to earn an income. And I think so more than earn an income, be a productive member of society and what that does. And so I'm nervous about what this means, just in terms of, firstly, widening inequality gaps, and then sort of this notion that, don't worry, we'll make sure that your basic needs are taken care of, and you don't have to worry about being an active participant in this conversation about where the data comes from, responsible use of data, accountable use of data, and people not getting left behind.
Thank you. Excellent points. Thanks.
So it's always a problem going last, but because Scott stole my point about responsibility. But for me, my second point, and it does touch on the medical, legal, and regulatory issues, is the issue of data. You talked about the power of data and the importance of collecting it, but how do you then protect? How do you protect that data and make sure that it's used responsibly and that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands? So for me, the big ethical issue is the whole management and custodianship of all this very rich data in the system.
Thank you very much. So I think, just to wind up, we thank you very much. Excellent inputs from everyone, and we can see the power of where we're going, but I think we can also see the risks, the ethical risks, the privacy risks, and the humanity risks. I think in the last 48 hours, there are companies now that's talking about genetic modification for embryos, so you can choose what kind of child you want. And so we are going to have to watch that space, and the space is moving so extremely fast. But your inputs have been really fantastic, and I would just add that when Shabir started as dean, one of the things that he said, just going back to medical education, was the importance of trying to appropriately integrate this into curricula and into education. So I think we're going to have these discussions on an annual basis, seeing the speed of what's happening. So thank you very much. A big round of applause to the panel.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I'm going to ask you to remain while we do the vote of thanks. But please, if you can just deliver the vote of thanks, and I'll give the gifts.
Thanks, Letta, and good evening, everyone. So, Collen, Bruce, thanks for making the time. And really, now, Helen raised the issue that we didn't really hear the word leapfrog mentioned. And I think we sort of should temper our expectations of generative AI. And the reason I say that is that, first, I probably should say that the faculty should pride itself in terms of being early adopters. When we look at what's happening in a number of the schools in the faculty, each of the schools have actually started different programs, be it teleradiology, telepathology, or even integrating AI into our curriculum. A number of schools have developed chat boxes, which are assisting the students in terms of their learning experience. So the faculty certainly has been early adopters, and that's important. But at the same time, I think what we need to recognize is that by not being early adopters, we do risk actually deepening inequity that exists currently in the world, and especially in relation to the global north and the global south. So certainly myself as a researcher, and that is where I've mainly used generative AI, it provides you opportunities that have never existed before. So many of you probably have heard of co-scientists that on a Google platform, and it sort of bridges that gap that exists currently in terms of the skill set that might not be available in your immediate environment, but which at a click at your button, you can actually bring it in. So when we write large grants in many of the Northern Hemisphere institutions, they've got whole teams of people with different expertise that come together and work on those grants for a period of 2 to 3 months. And that's what makes them competitive. We don't have that sort of skill set. We don't have that sort of luxury in the South. But generative AI actually provides you those opportunities. What used to take me previously 3 months to do, now literally doesn't take me more than 3 hours to accomplish exactly the same with a much higher quality of output. So unless we're early adopters, we actually risk deepening of inequity that exists, not just in research, but also in relation to service delivery. But the reason I say we need to temper our expectations of what generative AI can deliver is that 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity of going to Kenya. And I visited two institutes, KEMRI, which is a highly regarded research institute that really does state-of-the-art research. And they've been there for 30 years now. And they're highly regarded for the scientific output. And they could be the sort of institute that will be early adopters of AI. But when I walked into the neonatal ward, the highest level of care they can provide in a neonatal ward is supplemental oxygen. They do not have surfactant more than 40 years after surfactant was discovered. They do not have mechanical ventilation. They don't even offer a neonate anything related, any inotropes. It's simply unavailable. So unless there's sort of strengthening of healthcare systems in the South, the value and the ability of generative AI to actually bridge that gap is not going to materialize. So generative AI is not the solution to all of the challenges that we face. How many of you have heard of Delphi 2M? Delphi 2M. Okay, so this is a tool that's been developed using longitudinal data from the United Kingdom. And it's able to predict your risk of developing more than 1,000 diseases over the next 20-year period. Right? A tool that's already been developed and is actually being it's been piloted in the UK. Now imagine that tool, what opportunities that it offers. But at the same time, when you're able to predict what type of disease you're going to develop, but you don't have any access to being able to prevent it, or the worst case scenario, being able to have curative services that addresses it, it comes to naught. So I think the challenges that we need to sort of take on is not just about integrating generative AI into our teaching, into our practice, into our research, but also what is required for us to actually benefit from the opportunities that exist. And unless we actually understand what you need at a background, we're not going to be able to leverage on those opportunities. So I think there's a number of issues. Like Helen, like you mentioned, this is a meeting which we probably could have every 3 to 6 months, and there would be new information that is emerging. So a lot of opportunities, but I think at the same time, for us to really benefit from this, there's a lot of challenges which we need to address. So with those few words, first and foremost, just to thank Collen and Bruce again for making the time. Scott, Aisha, we haven't met before. Welcome, Maurice, once again. Thanks for making the time. And Helen, thanks for having chaired this panel. In addition to that, I think I just need to acknowledge a number of other individuals that have been involved. Aletta, thanks for having made the effort and having put together this really interesting session. Highly appreciated. And then other individuals that do need to be recognized is Laura Kumalo and Leanne Van Howard, who are really the people involved in relation to arranging the logistics for this meeting. Last but not least, obviously thanks to all of you that are present that have taken the time. But once again, thanks for making the time, and hopefully this is the first in a series of these meetings. And we probably moving forward will have sort of much more focused engagements around issues on generative AI. We're already doing that to some extent in the undergraduate curriculum, and we're needing to do it in a number of different aspects. So once again, thanks everyone.